Hola, hello guys, welcome to a new lesson of Studying Spanish. In this lesson, we're going to speak about the verbs in Spanish, we're going to have an introduction into verbs in Spanish, and we're going to discuss some characteristics and traits of verbs in Spanish. So let's dive right into it. Here on screen, you guys can see the three main categories of verbs in Spanish. In Spanish, we have AR verbs, that is, verbs ending with AR, ER verbs, verbs ending with ER, and IR verbs, verbs ending with IR. We have a couple of examples for each of them. For example, with AR verbs, we have estudiar, which means to study, trabajar, which means to work, and amar, which means to love. All of those are AR verbs, they end with an AR. We have ER verbs such as ser, which means to be, vender, which means to sell, and correr, which means to run. All of those are ER verbs, they end with ERs, of course. And lastly, we have IR verbs, such as, for example, vivir, which means to live, escribir, which means to write, and recibir, which means to receive. All of those are IR verbs, of course, because they end with the IR. These are the three main categories of verbs in Spanish, and it's very important that these are the three categories of verbs because absolutely every single verb in Spanish in its infinitive form is going to end with one of those three terminations. So whenever you look at a word ending with AR, ER, or IR, that's more than likely going to be a verb in Spanish. And also, once we get into conjugation with working with the present tense, the past tense, you will see that we conjugate the verbs stemming from this rule. But we'll take a look at that later. For now, let's take a look at some more traits and characteristics of verbs in Spanish. So here on screen, we have the 5 most common verbs of the Spanish language. Number 1 is ser, which means to be. Number 2 is tener, which means to have. Number 3 is estar, which also means to be. Number 4 is hacer, which means to do or to make. And number 5 is decir, which means to say or to tell. So a couple of things about verbs in Spanish. First of all, as you can see, all verbs end with the three terminations we were mentioning, the AR, ER, or IR. That's the very first thing that you need to know. So just by knowing that, as we were saying, just by looking at a word, if it ends with an AR, ER, or IR, that's more likely going to be a verb in its infinitive. However, there's a couple of more interesting things here that we can take a look at just by looking at the verbs. If you take a look at the screen here, we're now looking at the present tense in Spanish. This is a quick example of how we would conjugate verbs into the present tense in Spanish. So here's the very first thing that we were mentioning. We're going to divide the verbs into AR, ER, and IR verbs, and we would take out the endings out of the verbs and replace them with the endings here below in red to conjugate the verb into the present tense, depending on the person we were speaking about. So this is how conjugation works in Spanish. This is what we're going to do with any tense, with the past, with the future, with progressive tenses. We're going to take out the AR, ER, or IR out of the verb and replace it. So that's why it's so important for you to know that the three categories of verbs in Spanish are AR, ER, and IR verbs. Another important thing to know is that in Spanish we have both what we call regular and irregular verbs. What that just means is that regular verbs are going to follow the rule that we can see here on screen, whereas the irregular verbs will not. That's very normal. That also happens with English and with our languages. So these verbs, all of the irregular verbs, you would just follow the rule you have here. You take out the AR and replace it with the endings here below, but with irregular verbs we will not. Let's take a look at a quick example. Here on screen, you guys can see 2 irregular verbs in Spanish, ser and estar, both of the verbs to be. If you take a look at their conjugations, you will notice that they do not follow the rule we were looking at a moment ago. For example, with the verb ser, we would have yo soy, tú eres, él, ella, ustedes, somos, sois, and son. And with the verb estar, we would have estoy, estás, está, estamos, estáis, and están. So they don't follow the rule that we were looking at a moment ago, but that's the only difference between regular and irregular verbs. So the irregular verbs will be a matter of a little bit more practice and a little bit of memory, but I will give you some tips later down the road to learn the irregular verbs very easily in Spanish. So now you guys know the 3 main categories of verbs in Spanish, AR, ER, and IR verbs, and you know that in Spanish we have both regular and irregular verbs. This is very, very important. This is going to be the base for learning conjugation of verbs in Spanish and learning how the tenses work. If you guys have any questions or any doubts, please feel free to comment. Leave a comment in the comment section below. I'll be more than glad to help you out with any questions or doubts. Muchas gracias.